become available. Jaco Timmerman's book on the disappearances in the Argentine, The Prisoner of Conscience, is published in the New Yorker and all the newspapers of the world. So we all know now what happens, not in the course of months or years, but almost instantly, and at a scale much larger. Sometime I thought it was a research project to actually try to map this on a log. Actually do it. And maybe Google Books will let one do this. You can do the word, but I'd like to map this to actually show you. But I'm absolutely sure there's a logarithmic increase in information about this material. So the third part of this is it sort of feeds on itself. There's an increasing opportunity for national and international engagement. Third-party influences. What are third-party influences? Well, third-party influences is a kind of politics which one of us, right, tries to influence a state on behalf of someone else. So it's absolutely what Amnesty, of course, tries to do, and what NGOs generally try to do. They try to pressure states to help individuals. There's the rise of boycotts, which is a third-party influence. There's the rise of international courts being able to be third parties in certain disputes. There's the rise now, we talked about this a little bit coffee yesterday, in the issue of using and we talked about this when Ali Miller was here, using the Alien Tort Claims Act, something in one country to pressure another country to do something about human rights or to make human rights right. So the expansion of the possibility of third-party influence, of actually engaging in this politics on an international stage, is vastly greater than it was before, and it sort of feeds on itself. You'll see this, the next point I want to make in the late 60s and 70s is the new sources of funding. You see this when you read the Jerry Labor, and I hope you maybe notice that. They get money from the Ford Foundation, they get money from the MacArthur Foundation, they get money from the Soros Foundation. Right? There's all sorts of new support. So the Ford Foundation gets involved. The Ford Foundation gets involved in developing microcredit, for example, in the mid-1970s, and in general develops its sort of increases its giving for development in the 1950s. So Ford is big on the international stage, and so is the MacArthur Foundation. Then there's also there's business support, but there are also public events. So, for example, Amnesty supports itself with actually a kind of cool project called the Secret Policeman's Ball. It's sort of a set up first a party in London, and now it's a party everywhere, in which it's basically a comedy show and dance to raise money. The guys who first produced it were the Monty Python comedians. John Cleese was one of the big guys behind this. So you start having this entertainment culture of human rights, which raises money for these things. Now this is the world concerts. Bono goes around the world as a representative of human rights. So we live now in a world in which great deal of a significant portion of pop culture, and certainly world music, is sort of, relatively speaking, engaged with this human rights world. So that starts though in the mid-1960s. I think the Secret Policeman's Ball is the first of these organizations. Well, this is sort of redescriptive. It's sort of a different view of sovereignty, that in some sense the sovereignty of states is challenged by people for whom these NGOs speak and act. So it's a democratization, it's a world democratization movement of some sorts. And this, again, really redescribes as this huge organizational expansion. And each of this expansion allows a stage for a further expansion. So that's kind of the account I would give of what happens in the modern era, which is the period from the 1970s, late 60s on. So this is the founder of Human Rights Watch, of Amnesty, and you see here the symbol, lighting the candle inside a barbed wire. Bringing light to the darkness is the image, and that's also their international. This is his first article, "The Forgotten Prisoners," and then you'll see this in the logo. This is the logo. It was called a Peace Prize in '77. So this is now a worldwide organization. So let me now. We're heading toward the sort of labor part of the Jerry Labor part. We're now in the late 1960s and 1970s, and we're going to talk about the founding of we're going to focus on NGOs in two categories: civic and political on the one hand, the economic and social on the other, and then we're going to see how this works its way into her life. So we're doing this general history. We'll redo some of this when we talk about her. So you get a second chance to go through it, okay? Let me stop here for a second. I wish I could do this to play a little piece. Someday I'm going to, in my History 5 class, someday I'm going to actually do a little music piece, but it wouldn't apply to here. Questions? Huh? Okay. So let me now turn then to one of the most important organizations that deal with the sort of principles of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the 1966 document, which deals with sort of basically the first half of the Universal Declaration. Remember the Universal Declaration had two halves, civic and political, social and economic. So we're talking about the civic and political. So let's talk about Human Rights Watch. And the whole notion of watch, which as you know is a kind of important part of Jerry Labor's book. So what happens here is that on August the 1st, 1975, there's a conference in Helsinki of all the European countries, of the United States and Canada, and the final act of that conference set up the so-called Helsinki Accords. Now, from the point of view of the Soviet Union and its allies, from the point of the reason they signed this document was the Western powers, the United States and Canada, agreed that the borders of Europe, as they were then set, were no longer in dispute. In other words, Germany would not challenge Poland's border. Austria would not challenge the Hungarian border. So basically, it's not exactly a peace treaty at the end of World War II. There was never a central peace treaty, but it was as close to a peace treaty of end of World War II as we're going to get. It basically said, look, the Soviet Union can maintain its dominance in Eastern Europe, and there will be no... The other side of that, what Brezhnev agreed is that, and yes, we will agree to recognize the freedoms of expression, religion, and movement and so forth in the Universal Declaration. Actually, we now think, not thinking very much about it, but for the first time it put the Soviet Union and its allies as signatories to a document, not just not signing, not abstaining, but as signatories to a document which argued for which set as a norm the civic and political aspects of the Universal Declaration. Now that yes.
Did the United States then recognize Soviet sovereignty over the Baltic states?
Yeah. In other words, there would be the political settlements of the Second World War were essentially in place. That's what the Soviet and its allies got from this. And that wasn't so clear. I mean, in retrospect, of course, you would say no one was going to invade Poland. But on the other hand, it wasn't so clear. And there were also other German domestic parts of this. I mean, the Chancellor, I showed you a picture of Willy Brandt kneeling at the Warsaw Memorial. That was part of this opening to the East. I mean, there's a larger story, which we'll talk about a little bit when John Connolly is with us. But basically, if you think about this document, it's an historically ironic document, in that one side says, yes, we'll sign this basically to get a geopolitical deal, and at the same time agrees to a set of civic and political rights. That now sets up the structure for this huge set of organizations, which, as you'll see, Jerry Labor becomes involved with. So when you said Helsinki Watch, what does that mean? Helsinki Watch is an organization which said they were going to watch that the Soviet Union and its allies met these norms. lived up to these norms at a time when states were, or at least were thought to be, still embarrassed by the fact that they didn't. So the Watch project has its difficulties in a world in which states just don't care how bad they look. In other words, Taylor in Liberia didn't care a lot about the fact that these horrible abuses were being exposed. I mean, he may now that he's in jail, but at the time, watching didn't help. But at this time, with these norms in Europe, it seemed like a bad thing to openly contravene these norms. So Helsinki Watch starts as a way of basically checking off whether the Soviet Union was meeting these demands. And this then expands into, and you saw this in the labor, into these various watch groups. So America's Watch starts in 1981, basically, to monitor human rights abuses in the Americas, which were mostly at the hands of U.S.-supported dictatorships. Then Middle East Watch, Asia Watch, Africa Watch. So by the late 1980s, the world, America in 81, Asia 85, Africa 88, Middle East 89, is being monitored by a group of people interested in research, dissemination, and advocacy that will embarrass states into complying with human rights standards. So that's what we do, and they've recently expanded into the area of social and economic rights, women, children, lesbian and gay rights, very controversially. I'm not going to. Not controversial from my point of view, but old timers in this organization. That's not we're not about these cultural and other rights. We're about civic and political rights, and others argue the opposite. And they do now, in fact, have organizations which work in each of these areas. And these and Human Rights Watch is famous, and you see this in the labor, famous for its scrupulous research reports on what goes on in each country. Each country has an expert in these countries. They know a lot. They have a huge research infrastructure. So by and large, if human rights says it, it's probably true. So their idea was that if you have facts, goes back to our earlier story about humanitarian, if you have facts that are established, you can begin to you can bring pressure on government to meet its obligations under these norms. Yeah.
Can you define economic rights or give an example on this? Because normally economic rights is a euphemism for corporations have the right to take stuff.
I agree. And that's not what they mean by this. They mean they're getting into microcredit, they're getting information on a transparent infrastructure for credit, those kinds of issues. No, I understand that economic rights means, yes. No, I'm talking this from their perspective, not from a. If you go on their webpage now, you'll find an economic rights section. So I just wanted to show you. This is when Eastern Bloc countries then try people, like they did the future Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, Havel, it seemed to be a violation of this. And Helsinki Watch and other ones that grow up